Let's be clear. I mean, this the invasion of Ukraine, which started in 2014, and the full-blooded invasion is down to one man and one man only, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He initiated the brutality, this genocidal war. However, by failing to back up Ukrainian security, by making a promise which NATO couldn't keep in 2007, arguably the conditions had been set for Putin to achieve his genocidal ambitions.
Now let's hear from General Sir Richard Sherriff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe. Is that what you predict from this gathering, a sort of welcoming signal, though obviously not the full embrace? And how big a problem for NATO is Ukraine's status at the moment, and indeed Sweden's?
I hope we're going to get more than just a welcoming signal. We had a welcoming signal at Bucharest in 2007, a promise that Ukraine would join without being properly backed up. And many of the problems that Ukraine faces stem directly, or at least indirectly, from that. So I think there's got to be it's got to be much tougher than that. It's got to be a clear signal that Ukraine will join the alliance as soon as conditions allow. The sort of machinery that Sir Michael has just been talking about, plus a clear route map that says what those conditions should be and how it should join. In terms of Ukraine being a problem, no, Ukraine is a major solution for NATO. It's not just one way. It's not just NATO saying, well, yes, okay, you can join. Actually, it is in NATO's self-interest for Ukraine to join NATO. Not only is Ukraine way ahead of any NATO army in terms of fighting 21st century warfare as it is, because of the experience that they've had in the last 15 months or so, and the ingenuity and frankly the genius they've been showing. They will be the strongest military, and many NATO armies, or all NATO armies, can learn a great deal from them.
But of course, Ukraine wanted to join NATO, before this awful war began, and NATO has shown, well, a pretty extreme reluctance. So why would that be, based on what you've just said?
Well, as I said, NATO promised Ukraine membership of the alliance at the Bucharest summit in 2007. And by making a promise but without backing it up, in other words, backing it up would have meant guaranteeing the NATO security and defense capability to protect Ukraine. That, if it had happened, might well have deterred what's happened since 2014 and, of course, since February last year.
So in a way, you hold NATO partly to blame for what's happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Let's be clear. I mean, the invasion of Ukraine, which started in 2014, and the full-blooded invasion is down to one man and one man only, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He initiated the brutality, this genocidal war. However, by failing to back up Ukrainian security, by making a promise which NATO couldn't keep in 2007, arguably the conditions had been set for Putin to achieve his genocidal ambitions.
Can we return to just briefly to the topic of these cluster bombs, which are obviously controversial? What difference will they make to the conflict? And will they make significant enough difference to be worth the fact that these are really horrendous weapons of war that nobody wants to see used?
Let's be clear. There is no such thing as a nice weapon of war. All weapons are vile, pernicious, and horrible. It's a question of scale. And cluster bombs are no different. They kill people in a horrible way, as does as does any weapon of war. I think the question you've got to ask is, does this make it easier for Ukraine to regain territory, to evict the Russians, and to force Russian surrender? The answer is yes. Does it make it more difficult for Russians? Absolutely, yes. And is it important that Ukraine succeeds in its counteroffensive? Well, it is absolutely important that they succeed. The sooner this war is over, the sooner Ukraine can achieve its military objectives, the sooner this war will be over, the sooner the killing of civilians, the massacres, the deportation of children, the rape of women stops. And so, yes, it's a horrible weapon, but if it's going to help Ukraine achieve its objectives and Ukraine wants it, it's the right thing to do.
Just finally, how closely will President Putin be watching what happens in Vilnius,
Well,
and what's his likely reaction?
this is a really important point. He will be watching it as closely as he possibly can. He will be watching it to get any sense of NATO weakness. So it's really, really important that NATO sends the strongest possible message from Vilnius. Number one, that it endorses 100% all President Zelensky's military objectives. Number two, that there is, as we've discussed, a firm invitation to Ukraine to join NATO and a roadmap to that membership as soon as conditions allow. I think it would be good also to see clear endorsement or NATO taking the gloves off as far as the provision of weapons and ammunition is concerned. We've seen this incremental drip, drip, drip approach that has resulted in the Ukrainians having to launch an offensive without proper air cover, without proper air superiority. And that is why it is taking much, much longer than they had hoped. And that is one of the reasons, of course, linking it to cluster bombs, they've had to ask for those. And I think also NATO should remove the restriction on Ukraine targeting Russian capabilities in Russia that are launching genocidal attacks on Ukrainian cities and the like. I'm thinking about the missiles and the weapons that have been launched at Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for expressing your firm views there. That's General Sir Richard Sherriff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe.